Hey everybody, Ed from Start and Clee here. We're all having a hard time with recent events, and our startups are struggling even more so because of them. What follows is a webinar that we put on in conjunction with Leah Brownlee and Matt Cooper from Squire Patton Boggs. They were kind enough to walk our group through the recent stimulus package, how to navigate it, and how to deal with some of the common questions startups have during tough times. Enjoy.
Just a quick introduction. Everybody's aware of what's happened. We have this global pandemic. Nobody's heard or seen of this since 1918 flu pandemic, and our government has responded in the biggest stimulus package we've ever seen. And we all want to figure out how we can share in that money that the government is putting out on the stimulus package. So today, we've gone through 3 phases of government legislation on this, and we expect phase 4, which will come in about a month after Congress comes back from its recess. Right now, $360 billion of immediate loan assistance to small businesses are out there under 2 programs, the Paycheck Protection Program, which we call the PPP, and the Economic Injury Disaster Loan Program, which we call EIDL. That is not enough money for the U.S. small businesses. So note that, because it's on a first come, first served basis on who will get the funds under those programs. The PPP program is brand new, did not exist ever in any form previously under the Small Business Act. The EIDL program is not new, so it has a structure and it has a different process because it's been there through Hurricane Katrina and through all Hurricane Sandy and all the different disasters that we've seen in recent history. We just haven't seen it personally in Ohio because we haven't had a disaster hit us. So I just want to jump in from the beginning at a high level. If you're on this call, you're probably a small business, 500 or fewer employees. There are a few exceptions to that where you could have more than 500, and that's looking up your NAICS code and qualifying for a small business under the NAICS. That and you're a small business concern, and we note that you're subject to the affiliation rules. This has been all over the news recently, and one of the reasons it's been all over the news is because the National Venture Capital Association did a lot of lobbying to try to change these as applicable to this plan. And we do know what the final rules are today. You can be a 501c3, tax-exempt veteran organization, travel business, or other business. And when we say other business, sole proprietorship, independent contractors do qualify. So don't forget about that if you are a consultant and kind of hanging your own shingle. You also must have been in business on February 15th and had employees that you paid salaries to. And this is a confusing thing that we've kind of figured out in the last few days, and it says, or independent contractors. So at the beginning, and I say that like a week ago, we thought that small businesses that paid 1099 independent contractors could count them as employees. That's not the point of this language out of the rule. It means that if you're an independent contractor and you're paying yourself, you can count yourself as an employee. And I'm going to skip over the affiliation rules. If somebody has an affiliation question, we have examples and slides in there about the affiliation rules. The general time this is going to come up is if you're owned more than 50% by someone who has a lot of other employees or a lot of other investments that they own more than 50%. Or if you have venture investment and they have certain control provisions in your shareholders agreement or your certificate of incorporation. That one is easier because we can get a waiver letter if it's the latter reason. If it's the former reason, unless you get them to sell their stock, you pretty much don't qualify under this program. So that's kind of the qualifying. Once you figure out that you qualify, you figure out how much you can borrow. So step 1, look at your payroll costs over the immediately prior 12 months. So that would be, in essence, due March 31st, for example, of this year from last year. And what payroll costs are is salary, vacation, parental or sick leave, healthcare benefits, retirement benefits, state and local tax, and allowance for dismissal and separation. So if you fired somebody and paid them a severance, that counts for payroll costs. If you're a sole proprietor or an independent contractor, it's a sum of payments to or income of the sole proprietor, that is, wages, commission, income, net earnings from self-employment, and it's not more than $100,000 in the year. And from that, you figure out that cost. You then deduct excluded costs, which Matt will cover.
Yeah, and I don't know if there's any brand new businesses here on the call as well, but if you don't have enough payroll history to go back through the last year, you would use January and February of this year to find that average calculation. So that's another way that is potential for seeing how much you can borrow. The excluded costs, the most important one is you can't pay any one individual more than $100,000 a year. So this is for both how much you can borrow here at the beginning, and it will also come into play at how much you can pay someone and get recovered at the end. But that's the cutoff for both employers. And then if you are a sole proprietor, independent contractor, same thing for how much you can pay yourself.
And just a quick note on that. That's pure salary dollars. That's not healthcare benefit costs, 401k benefit costs, or any of those other benefit costs on top of it.
Right. This has to be for all employees that live inside the United States only. Payroll taxes. So this is a kind of a complicated one. You can exclude payroll taxes that are only applicable to the employer. What you can't exclude are payroll taxes that you would be withholding from the employee's wages anyway, if that makes sense. So, and that's the typical tax you're going to run into. It's the typical FICA type taxes. But sometimes you have additional federal taxes that are only to the employee based on these salaries. That is excluded. And then sick leave, Leah mentioned on the previous slide, that can typically be included. But if you're using the sick leave wages under the Families First Coronavirus Act, which I'll talk to you guys a little bit more later on, that is excluded. And the reason why is that there's already going to be a forgivable tax credit for that through that specific act. So it's basically preventing double recovery.
So, and sorry,
pause here.
I went forward, but I need to go back. Yeah, let's pause, and
Just
if anybody
because
has any questions.
I know specifically this has been a point of contention about the taxes and including it, and specifically because I was able to confirm that Chase's guidance is just flat out wrong, which is obviously a problem. But for in general, I think this is kind of how you just confirmed it, but just to put it in plain speech, would you say that it's essentially the employee's payroll, gross payroll, is what's being included, and anything that the employer has to pay? So you don't include any actual withholding separately. So if you pay, an employee $10,000 a month, you normally would withhold for federal, local, and state. You don't include that because that's included in their gross salary, right? But you, as an employer, you also have to pay taxes based on that employee. But this is not for that either. So it's essentially all we need to consider is gross salary and not consider any taxes at all.
Yes, that's a good way to look at it.
That's why there's been a lot of commentary or a lot of specific language around taxes, and it actually ends up being no taxes.
Well,
Right. So no.
Right.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Leah.
I was going to say, really, really no taxes as a kind of easy way to calculate it. We have this, the portion of the Medicare and Medicaid FICA, FUTA, stuff where the employer has their portion and then the employee has their portion that gets deducted. And so it's not quite that simple, but it is actually really close to that simple when we boil it down and calculate real numbers.
Okay. That's, I mean,
Yep.
now you're suggesting that FICA for the employee should be or subtracted from gross salary?
So I'm going to let Matt answer because I inadvertently
Say that
threw
again.
in some federal ones, and I meant to say the state version of it that gets
State withholding, yes. But
yeah,
still,
the state
it's still
withholding. Yeah.
So again, if you had $10,000 gross salary, you might normally have to pay 5% withholding or withhold 5% for state tax, withhold maybe 2% for local tax.
So it's the withholding you're talking about. That's actually the employee's tax, right?
Exactly.
So it's they're paying the tax. So
Yes.
So that part is different. So that you are not calculating because that has to be withheld because it's the employee's tax. It's not your tax. So
But
that
it's
is included.
gross.
So here, I've actually got this question in front of me, and I'll give their example, and maybe this will help kind of clarify it. So the question here is, how should a borrower account for federal taxes when determining its payroll costs for purposes of the maximum loan amount, allowable uses of the PPP loan, and the amount of a loan that may be forgiven? So it says, under the Act, payroll costs are calculated on a gross basis. So what you're talking about, without regard to federal taxes imposed or withheld, such as the employees and the employer's share of Federal Insurance Contributions Act, that's FICA, and income taxes required to be withheld from employees. As a result, payroll costs, so this is important part, the payroll costs are not reduced by taxes imposed on an employee and required to be withheld by the employer. But payroll costs do not include the employer's share of payroll tax.
So $10,000.
I think that's what you're saying, right?
Yeah. So
yeah. So for example, let me finish this, and then I think we're on the same page. I just want to make sure.
Yeah.
For example, an employee who earned $4,000 per month in gross wages, from which $500 in federal taxes was withheld, would count as $4,000 in payroll costs. Is that what you're thinking too? So the gross amount is $4,000. That's what is counted.
Yeah. So
the employee would receive $3,500 and $500 paid to the government. However, the employer side federal payroll taxes imposed on the $4,000 in wages are excluded from the payroll costs under the statute.
Yeah, which is this is all surrounding the monthly calculation, right?
Right. So yeah, you can boil it down because those taxes are typically going to be outside of the payroll anyway.
Yeah,
so I think the easy way to look at it is say gross.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah. So if we had 10,000, you take maybe 1,000 for federal, you take maybe 500 for FICA, which is another one of these things that is really questions, right? So it's 500 from the employee. Right. The employer also owes 500 on top of that. But in actuality, ignore all of that, and for the calculation we include the 10,000. But the employer has to also pay their share of FICA, and the employee also has to pay their side of the withholding. So the employer has to also withhold when they give it. But in terms of the calculation, it
when
seems
they
like
give it,
all
yeah,
is the gross.
Correct. That's correct.
It just seems a lot of extra language and clarifications on things that are just end up not being involved.
So basically, you just keep your payroll set up the way that it is, and you
exactly. For the calculation, you just include gross.
Where it could trip some employers up, where they have a different system where there are additional federal payroll taxes outside what you would typically have, and that's why the clarification is there. But for the typical employer, which I'm sure everybody on this call falls within that category, that's exactly right.
Okay. Great. Thank you very much. I mean, I just applied.
Yeah, you bet.
So I'm glad I did it right. But that was definitely a point of a lot of confusion for us. So.
Okay, good.
A question for you guys. For employees that do earn over $100,000, do you just, can you include them up to $100,000, or are they fully excluded from the calculation?
You include them up to $100,000.
Got it.
Okay, so once you get your calculation, you multiply your payroll costs, your average monthly payroll costs, by 2.5. And I want to make sure, because when Matt was talking, I was looking through some of the questions. Some of the questions were about new businesses. So just remembering that if you weren't in business for the full last 12 months, you just look at January and February of 2020 to do your payroll cost calculation. And so once you figure out how much you can borrow, go and fill out your application, obviously, with your lender. And right now it looks like most lenders are only taking applications from people who have business checking accounts with them. And so what we've been telling clients is call them under, some lenders like KeyBank are reaching out to their businesses. Other lenders like Wells Fargo and Chase are not telling anybody anything and just answering the phone if you call. So reach out to your lender, talk to your lender about what the process is. Almost everybody has an app in place that you can fill out from the comfort of your own home in the evening, over the weekend, etc. And we have not yet, and I actually forgot to ask Matt this question earlier. I haven't yet heard of anybody who's received funds as of today. So I'll ask Matt if
I received my first one today, actually.
Really? Oh, good.
Yeah.
They put it in last Friday?
I was surprised. No, yes.
And do you know which bank?
I do, but I'm not remembering. It's not one of the major banks.
Okay.
And maybe that was the difference.
So what was the turnaround time on that?
Okay.
About a week, it looks like.
Week? Okay.
Yeah, turnaround time was supposed to be, some people were saying same day, but about a week is not too bad if they can stick to about a week.
I could figure out
yeah. So once you get the money, what you're supposed to use the money for is set forth in the new law. And you can, if you use it for what the new law says you're supposed to use it for, you can get the loan forgiven. So, it starts out as a loan, and then you have to apply for forgiveness of the loan. So 75% of the money should be used for payroll costs over the 8-week period beginning on the date you receive the money. And the way they figured this out is you essentially have an 11-week period at the beginning that you calculate your payroll costs on and apply an 8-week period against that, which 8 out of 11 is, essentially 75. Not perfect math, but close. 25% of the amount can be interest on your mortgage, rent on a lease agreement, utility payments, and other Section 7A purposes, which, Matt, you can say what a couple of those are.
I can, if you give me one second. It's basically general. So it's very specific, but specific or case specific, but broad. So it's plant acquisition, construction, conversion or expansion, including the acquisition of land, materials, supplies, equipment, and working capital. And to make loans to any qualified small business concern. But whether any of those are proper in a specific scenario is going to depend on your circumstances at that particular time. So if you use it for any of these purposes that are not enumerated here, you want to do a further risk analysis at that point in time. And regardless, you want to make sure that 75% is payroll.
Right. And so then on the
thing, all 100% is forgivable, not just the 75%, right?
Correct.
And then the next question is, what if I already fired people? What if I'm reducing their pay anyway because we need to reduce our cost of running our business? And so I'll start with something that's not on the slide. Anybody making over $100,000, you can reduce their pay by however much you want and not have an adverse consequence toward your forgiveness, other than possibly not having enough money to be forgiven that was spent.
Right.
And then I'll let Matt say, what the other two scenarios, so the under $100,000 salary employees and just reducing salary employees.
Yeah. So you can look at it broadly as overall just reducing payroll costs, and that can be done in two ways. One is you're not able to maintain your workforce, or if you've already let people go, you're not able to bring them all back. So say you made your calculation for the loan based on 10 employees and you can only bring back 5, you would only be entitled to a 50% recovery or forgiveness of that amount. That's pretty easy when you're talking about number of employees. When you talk about the second category, which is based on a reduction of salary, when we're talking about 100,000 and under, if you reduce someone's salary by more than 25%, then that will also be offset. That amount will also be offset from your loan forgiveness. So in this case, we'll kind of use the same numbers. If their salary was 100,000, you cut it in half to 50,000. That's going to be 25, or you can cut it to 75,000 without any problem. If you go to 50,000, then you're cutting it an extra 25%, which is an extra $25,000. That $25,000 will not be recoverable as well. That makes sense?
Yeah, the prorated amount of that. But there is, when we go to that salary.
And I actually,
go ahead.
And I actually just had a thought, Leah, and you can weigh in on this too, that I hadn't thought about before. So back to the previous slide, and we're talking about 75% used for payroll.
Mm-hmm.
That it doesn't mean, so if you have 100,000 cap on these individuals, I'm catching myself as I'm speaking out loud.
No, the payroll
so I guess
calculated the same in both instances, the forgiveness and the calculation of what you are eligible for.
Correct. Okay.
One thing I wanted to know is we reduce based on number of employees. So if you fire employees, you have a reduction. There is but what if I rehire employees? Okay, so special rules for rehiring. You can reductions in employment that occur between February 15th and April 26th, as compared to February 15th, will not reduce your amount of loan forgiveness if you rehire employees by June 30th. So this is especially applicable to a lot of the service industry businesses, whether it's I'm thinking more food services, but it really depends on how impactful that this is to your business and if your workers can work from home. So next thing, how do you request loan forgiveness? Theoretically, you just go back to the same lender, and you can go back 8 weeks after you get your loan and start the process of loan forgiveness. And they have 60 days following the time your application goes in for loan forgiveness to tell you what amount is forgivable or if all of it is. You do need to give them evidence of payroll and the evidence of the expenditures that you believe are forgivable. Notably, this is really fast-moving legislation. So the SBA worked really hard to get out the rules regarding what is done to get the loans out and to get the money dispersed and into the economy. They have not yet issued their guidance on the rules on how to forgive the loan. So we're still waiting on it. So last Friday was the first day to start applying. People are applying every day. As I said earlier, first come, first served basis. We think that the government is going to add more money to the program. They have not done it today. So I would, if you are interested in doing the Paycheck Protection Program, I would go earlier, not later. Starting tomorrow, if you're an independent contractor or self-employed, that is the first day that you can apply. You can generally apply at any SBA lender, which in Cleveland is most banks, but Huntington's the biggest one. And as we said earlier, contact your bank where your checking account is for your business and work with them. Because a lot of banks are saying we are not taking applications from people who do not have accounts with us. The one bank that is in Cleveland, but you have to get in line, is U.S. Bank. So if your lender is turning you away, if you're not having any luck, there's a few options, but the one local option I know is U.S. Bank. And if anybody's having problems, I can send you the process that they've sent me. So this is a loan. So if it's not forgiven, you have to pay it back at 1% interest. It's 2 years. It's 2 years from the day you receive the funds, and you don't have to start making payments for 6 months. Also, no penalty for prepayment. So, you know, what I'm telling people is if you don't know if you need the funds, you should apply for the loan, because you can put them in a bank account and not use them and just pay back the money. The application, we have a link in what we'll send out to the sample application. So I would recommend that you look at it, read it, fill it out before you go onto the bank portal and fill out their application. It should be the same questions. A lot of banks put a few asks, but it's the same questions and the same information that you need to accumulate. Most of that's payroll documentation, purposes of the loan. You need to know the owners of at least 20% of your business. And this is an area where we see banks saying different things that they want to see. So for instance, Chase is saying 51% of the owners. I've heard that M&T is asking for 100% of the owners on your cap table. So just be ready that your bank's going to layer on a few more verification steps other than what's in the application. You're going to have to make certifications, which you can read if you want to read this presentation, and you should read in the loan application, because, you know, if you certify falsely, there is, you know, they can go after you for fraud. And we expect that there will be a lot more white collar crime cases that come out of this overall, because anybody who looks at free money, you know, some people aren't going to do it honestly. So that's Payroll Protection Act. I moved over to the Employee Retention Tax Credit. This is completely different, and you cannot get this if you take a PPP loan. What the ERTC program is a refundable tax credit equal to 50% of qualified wages paid to employees up to $5,000 per employee. So you know, there's maybe not a lot of circumstances where you will opt to not get the free money, but the good example I've gone through is, think of a restaurant business where most of the employees were laid off, late February. So there was plenty of employees when you do your 12-month look back, and plenty of money that could be had. However, you're not planning on opening your business soon. So if you take the PPP money, it's going to be a loan and you're going to be repayable because you're not going to qualify for the forgiveness amount. Or you could take the people you continue to have on staff and get a credit for up to 50% of their qualified wages through your taxes. And that might be better free money for your business than the PPP program. And just a note, you don't have to wait till the normal tax filing date. You can actually file the tax form immediately and start offsetting the taxes that are payable under this program. So under both of the loans, one thing on a tax consideration, the amounts forgiven are not income by law. So usually if a loan's forgiven, it is income, it is not here. If you take the employee retention tax credit, but later get a PPP loan, then you have to give back your tax credit. So you can't have both. And then, as I went through decide what's best for your business. And then I'll ask Matt to quickly go over the EIDL program.
This is similar. There's not as much guidance yet on this program. Economic injury disaster loans generally are not something that's new, but this particular version in the CARES Act is. And so at this point in time, I'm just going to hit the highlights, which are it's the same eligibility criteria, 500 employees or less, but you can use the funds for more things than just payroll and interest on loans. However, this loan is not forgivable. But you can get a $10,000 advance on it, which is forgivable, but everything else is going to be at an interest rate up to 4%. So it'll be kind of a typical SBA type of loan, perhaps with some conditions on it, other requirements that we'll see probably in the coming weeks as regulations get passed about this. One important thing to know is that you cannot get an EIDL and use it for the same purpose as a PPP. So if you're getting the PPP, you're using it for payroll, you're using it for interest, things like that. You can't also get an EIDL and use it for the same thing. If you're using it for different things, then you can get both. You can get up to $2 million on these loans, so they're a bigger chunk of money that you can get, and may be useful in a certain circumstance if you know that you can survive long term, and this will allow you to do it and make it happen. But if you're just trying to stay afloat and you don't know what's going to happen, this is a little bit riskier. If you start using the funds, however, like Leah said with the PPP, you can get it, you can defer payments, and you could just pay it all back if you do so before 6 months. I think we'll skip the rest of that now, but it's probably a good time to take questions up to this point in time.
Absolutely. I do want to say something that's a little bit complicated, just between the two of them. If you get the EIDL before you get the PPP, and they're for the same purposes, you can do it that way, but the PPP will refinance the EIDL. So if you have a 30-year term on an EIDL and then you apply for the PPP for the same purposes, you'll now have a 2-year term loan.
Awesome. Thanks so much for that. That's like so much information. I appreciate that you're going to share that presentation because I think a lot of people will probably obsess over it a little bit. If you don't mind, I'm just going to pull sharing away and put that Google Doc with the questions on, if that makes sense. So hopefully everybody can see this. But yeah, so anybody who wants to ask questions, feel free, or we'll go through these questions that people have sent ahead of time.
I just wanted to clarify what you said about the loan, that if you pay back the loan within 6 months, you have no interest? Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay, thanks.
Yep, payments and interest are deferred for 6 months.
Great, thanks.
So just speaking as a independent contractor, when I'm not doing this, I was trying to navigate today what made the most sense because, you know, I don't have a business bank account. Everything's run through my personal at PNC, and they won't allow any non-business bank accounts to apply for the PPP loans. So I don't know if I even have an option there A couple of other people expressed something similar in the questions that we've got here, sort of questions around 1099s and independence and how is the best way to navigate. With the EIDL and the initial advance being potentially or not repayable, I guess that's a big question mark in my mind. Like, I wonder if that's actually a better route for a lot of people. I don't know.
So let's address the repayable part first. The repayment, so it's up to $10,000, and I want to stress the up to, because the SBA is going to determine how much money you need based on your application. It is not repayable if you do not qualify for the EIDL loan. If you do get the EIDL loan, it becomes part of the loan. If you get that $10,000 and then get the PPP loan, it offsets your forgiveness amount.
Right.
So then it is repayable as well, but you have different maturity and interest terms on it. So that's the first item. The second item is, what if my bank doesn't accept it? US Bank is the one that's branded that I've seen saying we have a plan for taking applications from people who are not our current business customers. So I can send you the information when I send you the presentation, Ed, as well, for US Bank. And Forbes every single day is posting a list of which banks are taking applications across the country. So look it up, because it's usually about 6 hours old by the time you find it on the Forbes website.
Yep. Yeah, I think there's sort of this dynamic in early stage companies. I'm not sure how many people on the call, but multiple people have been asking me, my company is not funded. It's 3 co-founders who are basically just working for equity, but have either full-time jobs or are doing contract work to pay our bills. And they are trying to navigate this. And I think that's really a big unknown, especially since the unemployment side is still completely, at least in Ohio, completely up in the air. It seems like the CARE Act includes 1099s in the unemployment benefits, but no guidance seems to have been issued.
Agree, no guidance as of today. We're watching new guidance every day, but that one has not landed yet.
On the unemployment front, yes, you would be eligible as a sole proprietor 1099 contractor for those federal claims. They still need to be administered by the state agency who will determine eligibility.
Right.
And that hasn't been established yet, but it should be soon. But once that happens, you can backdate times. And one thing to know, which I'm seeing a lot of different areas are not considering, is that you don't have to have, in many circumstances, your job end completely for you to be eligible for unemployment. So if your employment is cut 80%, your pay is cut 80%, your time's cut 80%, you may be able to collect unemployment for that percentage of time.
Yep.
And so don't just discount that possibility by virtue of the fact that you have a little bit of work, or you're just you have enough to try to keep your restaurant going until you can get back up and running.
Yep.
There's especially under the federal plan, there's a very good chance that you can recoup some, if not all of that.
Yeah, and notably, if you have employees, think about, rather than cutting their pay by 20%, cut their days by 1 so that they can go and get unemployment for that cut number of days. So if you can afford them to work less, it may be worth it to the employee to be able to get unemployment for working less days a week and taking less salary from you.
Right.
Got it. So I think we answered what's the difference between a PPP and EIDL. That's fairly clear at this point.
There's question number 11. I can quickly answer. It's that personal guarantee question. So We do have a personal guarantee of anybody who has 20% or higher ownership on an EIDL if the loan's over $200,000.
Got it.
In addition, we have collateral that is pledged if the loan's over $25,000. If the loan's over $500,000, you're looking for real estate collateral.
Wow. Okay.
Is that new?
Yeah, I have a friend that got a job with the SBA to answer all these questions every day for 70 hours a week. So they hired 3,000 people in the last week. So I've been getting a download every day of what the training is.
Yeah. So just running through these small business relief loans about current payroll. Is there a way to fund hiring new employees? No, that's not the point, right?
No. Right. That's not the point.
Okay.
Well, but let's make a little clarification on that though. When you're getting the loan, so when you're talking about the loan amount that you're going to get, yes, you're only talking about current payroll. But when you're talking about what you pay, you could use that money for a new employee and it could still be forgiven because it's a payroll cost. That makes sense. So say
okay.
you can't hire back the same employee for whatever reason, but you hire another employee just because they weren't on your payroll at the beginning doesn't mean that your numbers are out the door. You just can't prospectively say, I have 10 employees now, but I want to have 15. And so I'm going to put that on my current payroll for the calculation.
And I think knowing where the question came from, I think this person has, one employee and is like, man, can I go hire 2 more using my existing payroll to, get that loan and then use the money, even though we don't need it, use that money to, and that's sort of,
I guess the answer is yes, but it'll change how much is forgivable and how much is a loan.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that goes along with 6 and 7 as well. Sort of, my company is pre-revenue. We have 18 months of funding to cover salaries. As we're developing a product, they don't have any product on the market. Is it okay to utilize the PPP to cover our payroll? And I think Brad Bell had a article like, you shouldn't.
Well, I know specifically because I just finished it and I am crazy about all the very specific language that's used. Every single one of these is requiring you to certify and quote, current economic uncertainty makes this loan request necessary. So if you have 18 months of payroll or 18 months of funding, I don't think you're at risk, right? You can't legitimately say, I'm not going to be able to fund my employees through this period.
Right.
Right. And I would just add that there's probably a lot more nuance to this question than is what is here. So say, for example, that 18 months of funding is not only for salaries, but is for other costs. And because of this crisis, you have to start using it for other areas, and therefore you're not going to have enough to cover salary. You may be able to make that certification that COVID is negatively impact your economic circumstances that make it necessary. So I don't think this is an absolute no, but
it depends and look at it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I would say, let's say you're in a med device company and you just changed your FDA timeline by 6 or 7 months because of your supply chain and that you can't have people in a lab. You really might need the money because before this was getting you few FDA approval. It really is dependent on the circumstances.
Yeah. Or you may be doing your Series A or Series B or whatever, and it totally messes up everything.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. One thing I want to note, and it's not in that question, but it does say pre-revenue. A pre-revenue company, we don't think can get an EIDL. We think you have to have revenue.
Right.
Yep. Really?
Yeah, because they have revenue questions in their application.
Yeah, for the last 12 months prior to Jan 30. Yeah. So venture-backed companies who are pre-rev would have to get a PPP then.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
I mean, do you think that
And
the
and
rest
it,
included in the SBA part of the PPP?
So there's no revenue requirement for the PPP. And when I say we don't think on the EIDL, as Matt said earlier, they haven't issued their regulations. So we don't think, based on the way the law is written, that we can do that. But the regulations might change how we think.
I saw both those questions being included on both Keen and Chase only for the PPP.
So I think I've tried to alter some of the text of some of the questions so they would not indicate who is asking them. But number 5, we're a startup with venture backing from a local investor, and I've heard that from some people that we aren't eligible for PPP loans to be forgivable because of the terms of the investment. So
That's possible.
Yeah.
So what I want to say on that, let's say the terms of the loan are based on the standard NVCA document, or the terms of the investment are based on the standard NVCA documents. Typically, a venture investor is not going to have so much ownership of the company that they're going to be able to control them by owning more than 51%.
Right.
They're also not going to have enough board members that they're going to control majority of the board.
Yeah.
But they may have a blocking vote on things that the SBA determines are problematic. And one of those things that we see in the standard venture NVCA documents is a blocking vote on dividends, which seems reasonable when we're all negotiating it, but the SBA says this means they have control when the investor director has to vote for it. And so the guidance is really that as long as they irrevocably waive their right to whatever the problem provisions are, they can apply for the PPP loan. So we need a side letter with that investor saying that that provision will no longer apply, and that's probably the quickest, easiest document to do rather than getting a newly signed shareholders agreement or refiling your articles of incorporation.
And if the investor has, let's say, of 5 board seats, 2, is that fixable?
So if the investor has too many board seats, they need to give up their board seats and like literally remove the people from the board. So everything can be fixed. Mm-hmm. The easiest ones are the control voting provisions. But we can fix other things, and probably the hardest thing is the ownership amount.
Yeah. Well, and without getting all opinionated, local investments have a tendency to have fairly high provisions of control, which I think consternates everything.
Well, and now local attorneys that are negotiating these are going to have a gotcha provision that just says, we think the company will disqualify from any SBA loans if you put this provision in. Yep. Literally today, I renegotiated a point in a term sheet for an investor and said, we can't put that unanimous vote in because it's, they had a unanimous vote on borrowing more than $20,000. We're like, can't do it. Yeah. They won't be able to get the PPP loan that they literally applied for last week. No.
No, that's awesome. I mean, it's not great circumstances, but it's
before we move on though, Ed, there's been some question about having a venture fund investment and how that impacts the employees that a company has, because if you are you have an investment from a fund that has a bunch of investments, then you have to count all of those together, which may then obviously be more than 500. So do you have any specifics on what you need to check for that?
So that's the control provisions that I was talking about. So the first one is how much of your company do they own? If they own more than 50%, check the box there. You need to count all their other employees. If they have control of more than 50% of your board, or the ability to control more than 50% of your board. So let's say they're the biggest investor at 35%, your next biggest investor or owner is 5%. They have the voting ability to control the board. So you have to do the calculation. It doesn't just trigger on the 50% ownership.
So every single venture fund that would own more than whatever that controlling interest in, they'd have to calculate all of their employees together to see whether or not they qualify for any of this?
Yeah, so they have to go to each of their investments in their portfolio, figure out if they have control over that investment in their portfolio. If the answer is yes, figure out the number of employees in that and start aggregating throughout their portfolio.
So would the startup then be able to still apply separately if that provision was, if they were okay with that or under the 500 mark?
So yes, absolutely. If you're under the 500 mark, everybody in the portfolio is set and you're not, and everybody's a small business.
Okay, so individual.
And I'm betting it'll take longer than a week to process if somebody tries to dig in.
Okay.
Yeah.
So,
I have an existing SBA loan. Can I also get one of the stimulus relief loans?
yes.
Yeah, that seems like a no-brainer.
Not completely. Lee and I debated it a little bit earlier.
Yeah.
Making sure it wasn't
Making sure.
too easy. Yeah. But yes.
Cool. So application process, Cia Morris. So application process, I think we ran through, Keith, did you ask that one?
Yeah. Yeah, I think we've addressed that unless anybody else wants to talk more about it. I do want to say the unfortunate position as employees is we're not, or as attorneys, we're not actually doing applications. So we're trying to get as much information from our clients that are doing it and the people that we know, but we're not doing the applications ourselves.
Yeah, I would suggest anyone who's looking into it to look at the actual SBA application itself, which is available from the SBA website, because that's what all the banks are referencing. And I found a lot more clarification on the language in there that was not included in the bank applications themselves.
Oh, and they have instructions, so you can read the next 2 pages of instructions in case you don't know what one of them means.
And then the FAQ is actually really helpful too. But that's all from the SBA and not provided by the individual banks.
Yeah.
So we talked about the IDL advances up to $10,000, and that potentially does not require repayment.
Yeah.
Unless you receive the IDL.
What if you refuse it?
I don't know what happens if you refuse a loan, because what the statute says, the 10,000, by the way, is brand new. And for the EIDL program, that hasn't existed previously. And what it says is if you don't qualify for the loan, it becomes a grant.
Oh, okay.
Gotcha. And then we talked about the taking EIDL loan and converting it to PPP is actually basically just a refinance of a loan that, as long as it's eligible.
Yes. So you're refinancing a loan that's at most likely 3.75% interest and can have a maturity of up to 30 years. Into a loan that's at 1% interest that has a 2-year maturity.
Yep.
And you have to refinance it if you do the EIDL first, and it's for your payroll purposes.
Yeah.
Just to be clear, though, you could do an EIDL after the PPP as long as it's for different purposes. Is that non-payroll, or is that non-payroll during this very specific period that the PPP is for?
Matt, you know the answer? I think it's not covering that 8-week period.
Okay, because it'll last months, right? So if we use our 8-week period and then we're still struggling, we could then apply for an EIDL and still use for payroll, but it's just not during that same period.
Yeah, that's my reading.
Okay,
right.
Great to know.
Okay. And that use of funds, keep track of all the documents and how you actually use the money if you get one of these loans. because to get it forgiven on the PPP, you'll have to prove the uses of funds.
Yeah. And I'm guessing, by the time they actually go to put the guidance together for the forgiveness, most of the crisis is going to be over. And so they're going to be less lenient than they're acting like they are now.
Yeah, I think so.
You got a recommendation to actually, whatever funds you get, to put it in a completely separate account and only use it for the approved expenses, so that there was a very clear line that can be drawn between them.
I think that would be a very easy way to delineate the differentiation of funds.
Yeah.
So this is kind of a weird one. Co-founder can't go without a salary. Can he claim unemployment benefits? We're only 2 employees on an LLC who are being paid, via draws rather than payroll. I don't really know what the answer is there.
Well, it depends on how. So, if the work's being cut, there's some type of reduction in either pay and especially if combined with duties, then yes. Is he or she currently being paid a salary?
I think I know.
Or were they?
And so they're being paid like via draws out of the LLC, like draws on the ownership, rather than. So I don't know if you pay unemployment on that. I can't remember. So I guess if you don't pay unemployment insurance on that because they're both owners, would they qualify for unemployment?
Yeah, I think very unlikely in the state of Ohio, just for typical unemployment, but potentially under the new federal CARES Act guidance or not guidance, statute, depending on what the guidance ends up being. So I would not take that off the table. I think because the individual, I think pretty clearly qualifies by virtue of their position, even though it might not otherwise. The type of payment, even though if it's a little bit weird,
Right.
it may be allowable. If they were just getting paid a straight salary, but now are only getting draws and they can't get any of it, then I think that changes the analysis and they may qualify anyway.
Yeah, let's probably ask your lawyer on that one.
Yeah.
Most of these are. So I think that is most of the process and stimulus specific questions. We've got a few sort of general business
Yeah,
questions.
so Matt's if you're planning on firing attorneys, Matt is an employment lawyer. He can tell you how to do it if you want to answer that question.
Yeah,
Yeah, I can answer that. The best way is if you do have to lay them off, you can't afford to pay them, just let them go. To make it easy, you can give them a short letter saying we're unable to pay because of the COVID pandemic and related crisis, something along those lines. And that's it. And with that, they should be able to recoup. If they're making under, I can't remember if it's 75 or 50,000, but if they're making under that threshold, they should be able to recoup all of their salary through both state and federal package, at least for the short term. And if more, they can still recoup a good portion of what their salary was. So just have to deliver the hard news, but you can help them out by clarifying for them that it's related to this pandemic, and then they can get unemployment, and it's not going to count against your unemployment insurance rate if it's COVID related.
Right. Yeah, I think, obviously this is a fairly small organization, so there are some good checklists. I don't know if you guys have any of sort of like how to go about actually laying off or firing an employee. Like that's always a new thing when you're founding a founder of a company. And it's usually tough because if you got 3 employees, then you're probably a pretty tight knit group.
Right.
So
if it's only those 3 employees, it's a pretty case specific question. So we don't really have a checklist for it. If it's only 3 employees and you're laying off all 3 employees and it's solely for business reasons, I don't think there's much you need to look into. There's just no way to keep them, and so you can let them go.
Okay.
If you're laying off 3 out of 10 employees, then there's some things you want to look at, because if you have 10 employees, 3 of whom are women, and you lay off 3 women, you're probably going to have a problem.
Yeah.
And there's lots of other scenarios that can fall into that type of circumstance. But I'm understanding this as I have 3 employees. I have to lay off my 3 employees because I can't pay them.
Yeah.
There's not much of an analysis.
Yeah.
It's more of just like, how do I break the bad news to them, and how do I help them get paid through the government?
Yeah, so an official letter referencing the pandemic, best practices, and then do what you always do when you fire an employee: get their computer back, disconnect their email, stuff like that. Don't ask them to keep on working even though they're not getting paid.
Yeah.
Definitely don't do that.
So here's a question though: should you fire yourself? I'm not even this was a one-off.
No, I know.
No, when you think about it,
Not
actually,
a bad question.
somebody else paid. I could fire myself, keep everything going,
Yep.
and then I could apply for unemployment and get majority of my salary back for a short.
That depends.
It's incredibly strategic, but if you're faced with either firing one of my employees that I love and might have a family and I don't, or things like that, like what is that a legitimate option?
It is, with the caveat, it depends what your articles of organization look like, what your operating agreement, things like that look like, how you're set up.
Somebody still has to run it,
but I can
do it. Yeah, that's true.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, so if you're an LLC and you're the manager of the LLC, it might be less easy to fire yourself.
Without being an employee, right?
Right, but you can also, using that same setup too, if you're LLC and you're the managing member, but you're also a manager of the business and you're set up as a W-2 employee, those can be 2 separate things under your operating agreement. So you may be a member and you may get paid, say, $5,000 a year or something for that duty. If you are not getting paid your salary, you can file for unemployment on that, and you can still remain the member and not have to relieve yourself of that duties, because that's a separate thing than what your actual employment status is.
Could you also just cut your salary by 90%, or does that get into really mixed things about I'm cutting my salary 90% so that I can file for unemployment or partial unemployment? But I'm the one that has to do that, right? So.
Right. No, I think if you're having to choose, if you have to do it, if you have to cut someone and you make the business decision that it's you versus somebody else, I don't think there's a problem you're going to run into there.
Mm-hmm. Because that would maintain everything else, maintain your W-2 status,
exactly,
all of your management status, and maybe being able to make decisions on behalf of the company. But at the same time, that's where you can easily cut and not have to let somebody else go.
Right. You may run into problems if you say you make a 90% salary cut, but you're still working 100% of the time. The agency might not like that. I've yet
the unemployment agency.
That question, the unemployment agency. Yeah. I'm interested in this question because I've been trying to figure it out for a number of employees, and there's not much guidance. It's clear that if both salary and duties are reduced, that you can get that for reduced employment. Yeah. If it's just salary and not also duties, that's a little less clear. It's more state specific. And I don't know how that's going to be handled under the relief funds yet. But if you're talking more, and also to keep in consideration whether you remain eligible for benefits, things like that, your plan typically will be something like 50 or 65%. So it's not only a salary calculation that you're making.
But in Ohio, temporarily, from a benefits perspective, we have an executive order in place from the governor saying that reducing your
that's right.
amount of effort will not make you ineligible for benefits.
Your FTE status or calculation, doesn't matter for benefits. So you wouldn't lose potential health insurance and so forth, but you still
Right.
would
So if you,
issue with unemployment though. If you were working.
Potentially.
Yeah. Okay.
yeah.
Potentially. It's just unclear.
This was a shot in the dark that got really specific and really strategic really fast. So I
Right.
realize it would be so legitimate.
Yeah.
And
No,
so-
there definitely is an avenue there to explore with any type of cuts that are made, especially at this point in time.
Natural, most founders to be self-sacrificing anyways. So
Mm-hmm.
Just call it vacation. So last question we had. Other people, please speak up if you have questions. But this is an outlier. Should I raise money now or wait until the crisis is over? I have lots of opinions on this and could talk for an hour, but I'm interested in what you guys are seeing.
So right now, what we're seeing is very few deals getting closed, but there is still some traction and still some investors closing deals. We see more, what I'm seeing is more on the family office side, angel investors that are still, they have money, they're still interested in a good, company to invest in. And I think they're seeing a lot less deals being put in front of them right now. So there is an avenue to work forward if you need to raise money, and it's going to be harder than it was before. I don't think that's any doubt. That being said, the question is, if you have the opportunity to raise money now, or you should wait till the crisis is over. Obviously, that's a business decision, and Ed can have all the opinions he wants. I'm a lawyer. I'm risk adverse, which means I work at a law firm, not at a startup company. I would always tell people to raise money when you can and raise as much money as you can, because it always takes longer to get to the revenue point you think you're going to get to than you think it's going to take.
There were a few investors, VC people in London I was speaking with that were very eager.
And there's opportunity. And I think that depending on how much you've pivoted, I've heard, a new mask company that got an EUA within like a week, literally a nurse quit her job and made a surgical mask company and got an EUA. So if you're the entrepreneurial spirit, I've heard a lot of stories about brand new companies or companies in our ecosystem that have completely pivoted, in the first week or two of this to something where they can get government funding for the helping out with the pandemic.
Yep. Yeah, that's sort of generally been my advice when I've been talking to people is, if you're in a subset of types of companies, then now is your best time to raise money. Otherwise, raise as little as you can, to stay alive, because valuations are generally down. But if you had a round going with a term sheet signed, unless the firm is coming back and asking for an adjustment to it, no reason not to close it.
Right.
So that's all we had submitted. I haven't gotten any.
Can I ask another question out there, Ed? So that this gets into another bit of a kind of specific situation here, but the way I set up my current business is that I paid almost all my employees via 1099. And I only recently, kind of first quarter of this year, started looking pretty good, and I was setting up payroll and getting benefits going and all that sort of stuff. And then March came and I had to hit the brakes, let go of the one guy that I was going to convert. Then the other guy, I told him, you're staying 1099 until things go forward. So the early verbiage of the CARES Act sounded like it was going to work out pretty well for me, that I could include these 1099 guys in my calculation and continue to pay them through it, just find work for them to do, basically. It became clear on the Friday night legislation, or the rules, that I couldn't count them anymore. So I only counted my actual payroll, which was me. So I've switched now to basically giving them all the billable work so that they've got something to pay the bills. And I'm getting presumably paid back to the PPP here. But the question is, should I be telling these guys that are we're doing 1099 work through me, that they should go apply for this on their own behalf now?
Yeah.
And, if so, should they be reaching out to U.S. Bank? Because a lot of these guys don't have business banking relationships.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Yep.
Unfortunately,
yeah, and it was a good realization for you to make. Not everyone noticed that the rule, because that was our read on the statute off the bat too, and even the rule is a little bit contradictory, but their Q&A makes it pretty clear that typical employers can't calculate the 1099 contractors, unfortunately.
I mean, honestly, I'm glad they did it, because I was talking to the group that helps me with my bookkeeping, and they were talking about some of their clients, and the kind of stuff they were lumping in under the 1099 rule was basically everybody they sent a 1099 to.
Yeah, I've heard that too.
Yeah, it was going to be a lot of fraud if they didn't change that.
Yeah.
Right. So I've got to jump off here pretty quick, but I wanted to just give you guys a heads up on the remainder of the slideshow that we'll send out. We also have included in there are some slides on the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, which is the new provisions for emergency paid sick leave and for expanded FMLA. There's quite a bit of information in the slides themselves, but if you go to the links that we put at the beginning of our slideshow, there's pretty comprehensive compilations that we've put together on our website. So I would look at those if you have any questions about that. There's also some short guidance about what the EEOC is doing and what OSHA is doing regarding this that you might find interesting. So if you have more questions about that, forward them and get them to us, and we can chat about that. But I did just want to give you a heads up on that.
Cool. Awesome. Really appreciate you taking the time. And obviously the slides are hugely valuable. So thanks so much, guys.
You bet. Happy to help. Good luck, everybody.
Yep. Happy.
Thank you.
Good luck. And let us know when you get your loans. It's good for us to know that people are getting paid and the program's working.
Yeah. I think a lot of startups are experiencing, at least Valley-based startups who use like Silicon Valley Bank and some of the startup banks I've heard are having a lot of problems. A lot of the startup banks have no relationship with the SBA, and so they're not. You can't.
They had to apply to become an approved lender.
Right, which is apparently not an easy process.
Yeah.
So that's going to be an interesting challenge for a lot of the sort of traditional startup hubs. I think a full 60% of Y Combinator companies are using banks that weren't approved. So that's an interesting thing. But most of them are well funded anyway. So.
Ed, has anyone heard about the City of Cleveland Emergency Working Capital Fund? I just got an email on it today.
Mhm.
Yeah.
No. Can you send that to me, Michael? I'll look into it.
There's 2 programs in the city of Cleveland. I don't have them accessible, but there's 2 things. And one's for like if you're in manufacturing, and the other is if you're in a service thing. I don't know if it's that.
My email came in. It's called an Emergency Working Capital Fund. It's for a $10,000 loan for reimbursement for operating cost. And there's no payments or interest until January 1st, 2021. Then it's 1%, and it's $150 a month until it's repaid. So for gas, utilities, and stuff like that, it's through the City of Cleveland. I sent Ed a link for the Dropbox for it, and I sent Bob one.
I think I have it up right now. I don't know if everybody can see that.
There it is.
Yeah, and I just added it to the chat as well, so you should be able to download it.
Okay.
You've got to be in Cleveland.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay.
Yeah, your office needs to be in Cleveland. Yeah.
Yeah.
Which.
But it's limited funds.
Yeah,
too,
and please-
how much money's there. so.
Yeah. Share that information too if you have it. I'm particularly interested, obviously, because of the people I work with that work in the city of Cleveland. So knowing all that's very helpful.
Yeah, because
And
in my case,
yeah, and I'm gonna stop talking so everybody else can.
in my case, all I have is utilities and stuff. I don't pay myself. All of our monies goes for growth and for, utilities and overhead. So for me, it looks good because I don't have the payroll thing. So I don't take a salary.
There's also one from Verizon.
Really?
Have you guys seen that?
Got to buy their phones?
No, it's Verizon, Yahoo, and Lisk, LISC.
Yeah.
It's also, I don't know the volume of money, but it's a grant.
Oh, that sounds good. It's Verizon,
Look into
Lisk,
it.
and who is the other one?
Other one.
Yahoo.
Yeah. So.
And Lisk.
Got it.
So I think Matt has a conflict, and I'm going to apologize because I do as well. But I want to thank everybody for, yeah.
Yeah, no, you guys are good. Feel free to drop off. We'll probably just chat for a bit. So really appreciate the time, and thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Appreciate it. Thank you.